Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the 10 Academy series, and this is English Nerd. Today I have the distinct pleasure of having Timm Freitas with us from the Garden of English. He has a great YouTube channel full of advice for AP Lit, AP Lang. It's incredibly helpful. So I put the link down below. You can check that out. I would definitely advise it. He is somebody who has been in the AP world even more so than I have been, in that he's been a grader. He's worked with College Board, and so he has some great insights for us today about really common mistakes on the AP Lit exam and the Lang exam. It's very similar kind of issues. What tends to go wrong? So, hey Tim, thanks for being with me today.
To be clear, the pleasure is actually all mine. I was thrilled that you invited me to come on here, and I'm looking forward to talking about how we can help kids with their work, especially now that the AP exam is coming up rather quickly.
It's true, yeah. Now that you mention it, it's only a couple months away. So some things that I see, I'll just kind of start off and then see what you think.
Yeah.
One thing that I see is that often people will write kind of too little or too incompletely. So it's just the mechanics of the essay that are not as complete and compelling as they could be. It's just a paragraph or something like that. So there's just not enough there to really make a good case.
Yeah, when I think about that kind of common struggle that my kids typically come in with things like that, a lot of times they're writing sentences that are pretty much half of what they actually need to say, as opposed to all of what they need to say.
Mm.
So when I think about dealing with the mechanics of that problem, I notice that they'll come in and they'll talk about a lit element or a lit technique, but they won't actually pair it with the why.
Hmm.
So the first piece of advice that I always give my kids is that whenever they produce a topic sentence for a body paragraph, you know, which for anybody who might not know listening, that's the sentence that's going to guide the body paragraph. I make my kids always include a what and a why. So if they come in and they can already identify that the author is comparing two things, they might say the author compares this and this, period. And I'm like, well, that's really, it's true. But if we actually include a why there, that's going to actually help expand the clunkiness of that sentence, especially if they're like the author compares these two things. The text shows it here, and here's what this means. It's all very mechanical and kind of clunky.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get kids to mix it up by adding that kind of abstract why in the sentence, and you can do that with little sentence stems, it's going to make something better. So for me, I'll say, okay, put your why, your what the author's doing in your topic sentence, and your why, and now we've got a much broader sentence that's going to actually help guide things later on. So the author compares these things in order to, and then that word in order to in the topic sentence is really going to help kind of get rid of that clunkiness, especially in the topic sentence itself, and that can help kids kind of gather more understanding about what they're looking at.
Right, I see something really similar in my classes. I phrase it differently. So instead of just pointing out, here's a literary device that the author uses, well, who cares? What's
Yeah,
the significance of it? There needs to be some kind of meaningful connection. Otherwise, like, great, you've found that there's this comparison in your example, but why should I care? What does it matter to the work as a whole, or what effect does it have, or give me that additional step? Otherwise the analysis is it feels incomplete and not significant or persuasive like it ought to.
one other thing about that too is this idea of the mechanics are kind of clunky, and getting that why in there will help, or that purpose. The other thing too that helps keep it from being clunky is in a topic sentence in particular, putting a type of transition in there. The
Mm-hmm.
author begins by, then shifts to, then follows this with. And the only reason why is because then each body paragraph doesn't necessarily feel like it stands on its own. It feels like it connects to like what came before it. So just by putting in those little transitional elements and stems, that can actually create a stronger line of reasoning, and it can also bring out an understanding of structure that students don't actually know that they're typically dealing with at that time too. So those are just a couple little tips of like how can we get past the kind of clunky writing mechanics that are often problematic that oversimplify kids writing.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. The body paragraphs shouldn't stand on their own like a list, like a check list. Instead, it should be this leads to this, leads to this,
Right.
and in the midst of writing, for the AP exam, you are pressed for time. But as much as you can, there ought to be this leads to this thought rather than something that's particularly choppy if you can manage it.
Right, absolutely. And little transitional or chronological stems are very, very easy to come up with. I actually have a list if you want me to share it with you.
Yeah,
I can
that'd be
share that
great.
list if you want to post it down the bottom. And it just talks about here's what you want to do at the beginning. If you're talking your first body paragraph, here's a bunch of stems that you can pull for transitions for middle body paragraphs. And then for ending body paragraphs, here are some transitions as well. So I can email that over. Not a problem.
Yeah, thank you. That would be great. Something else that I tend to see pretty often is just using too much summary. Like, yes, it's advanced, kind of eloquent summary of the poem or the prose passage or whatever it may be for the lit exam anyway.
Yeah.
But not actually quoting enough of the text itself to make an argument. Do you see the same thing?
Oh, absolutely, especially at the beginning of the year.
Mhm.
Um, and there are a couple of different things the way that I deal with this with my students. One of the ways that I deal with it is I always talk about a letter of recommendation. I get along very well with the administration at my school. I don't fear for my job, but let's say, hypothetically speaking, due to COVID, funding was cut, and I lost my job. And I went to another school. I was interviewing, and they were like, "Okay, so how does your admin feel about you here?" And I was like, "Oh, my admin really, likes me." Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense if I'm looking for a new job if my admin likes me, right? Now, I have summarized what my admin has told me, but what about if I said, "Oh, you know what? Rather than me say everything, why don't I just give you the letter of recommendation that my administrator wrote for me
Hmm.
that actually says, Tim's a great teacher, but unfortunately we have budget cuts, so we're going to give him the highest recommendation as he leaves." Notice that I can say my admin really likes me. In fact, I want to share this with you, and then I give them the letter and I highlight that particular line. That's a way better way to do this. If I tell my students, if the text is in front of you, you have to quote the text, for sure. Don't just summarize the text. It's going to be much more powerful. Just like that moment, it's way more powerful. Rather than me just saying, "Oh, my admin likes me," I could prove it with some of the text. If it's hard for kids to kind of do that, though, they should find the text that they really want and summarize the context that comes before it that can flow into it. That's typically how I deal with that issue with them. I also give them a rule of thumb here, though, where I tell them no more than 15 words at a time in your textual evidence. Now, of
Hmm.
course, sometimes you might need a little bit more, but I think the real issue here is that the kids are providing too much summary
Hmm.
or not enough text, and we really want to find the balance. So I tell the kids, get some context, and then get your quote, and the quote it really wants to be less than 15 words, but make sure that we know how, like, why we're getting to that quote. I talk about like inviting a friend to a party when the friend wasn't invited. I'm like, you can't just bring him in and then have him stand in the corner because he's going to look weird. You have to introduce why he's there, but because he wasn't invited in the first place, you need to give the context as to why you brought on a wingman to your party. And so give enough context so that we know why the quote is there, and then let the quote speak for itself so that everything's all comfortable. Just a couple ways that I kind of deal with that in the classroom.
Nice. Yeah, I describe that in a different kind of way. So I say, okay, imagine that you're writing this essay to me. I've read the same poem, I've read the same passage or book or whatever it is, but maybe it's been a little while, and I
Yeah,
have a different opinion than you do. Like
right.
whatever your opinion is, mine is completely different.
Yeah.
So your job is to give enough context so I remember. Oh, right, that part, and
Yes.
then to actually prove that your opinion is correct. Just summarizing it's not going to do the trick because I've read it, I've come to a different conclusion. So you need to actually show me, okay, here, and here, the way that it's said, and all those things that we talk about, the literary devices and everything.
Yeah.
Like all of this actually proves my point, even though you've read the same thing and came to a different conclusion.
Right, and actually, that's important to talk about in relation to AP Lit as well, because for the thesis that students create, it's all about creating the plausible interpretation, right? or the interpretation of the work. And so that means that different people might have different interpretations, but now we have to make it reasonable. And that's a great way to put it. Like, you need to actually summarize into the quote enough where you can get me to understand your interpretation as we lead into it, so that it actually fits with what you're dealing with too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that also prevents people from, hopefully, the evil plan anyway, is that it prevents people from assuming that everybody agrees with your interpretation,
Right,
and actually puts the burden of proving it on you, which is kind of the point, to create a persuasive analysis.
right, right.
Yeah. Let's see. As far as the third thing that I see is that are issues with the prompt. So either not connecting all of the points to the overall point that you're trying to make, the prompt, or just addressing most of the elements of the prompt but leaving out something important. The most common thing that I see my students leave out, historically anyway, is the overall meaning. They'll talk about characterization all day long. They'll talk about the images in the poetry, but then sometimes they'll forget to connect that to the overall meaning. So what about you? You've graded a bunch of essays. Do you see
Yeah,
the same thing?
I've been doing AP Lit for, I don't know, almost 10 or 11 years now, so I've seen papers like this all the time.
Mhm.
So I originally had issues with students not connecting it to the overall meaning, but really what we're talking about there is, some people call it thematic insight. I call it universal insight. It's this idea of, how does this universally relate to me? So
Mhm.
a lot of times kids can keep it in the story, but now we have to get to the theme. One of the ways that I've dealt with that is, I have a pretty strict thesis template for my students in AP Lit, and it forces them at the very end of their thesis every time to say, ultimately illustrating that. And then they have to put a thematic insight there. So
Mm.
something universal. So it says, ultimately illustrating that, and they have to put an idea, and then they need to say what the insight about that idea is. But they
I
can't
like
mention
that.
the author, they can't mention a character in the story. It has to be something
Mm.
like, ultimately illustrating that individuals blank, or ultimately illustrating that, like, if I were to think about the Book of Mice and Men, they would write their whole thesis and they would say, ultimately illustrating that companionship, right, requires immense sacrifice.
Mm.
And we know that that's universal in nature, because I'm not talking about George, I'm not talking about Lenny, I'm talking about companionship and sacrifice. If they wanted to put people in there, they could say companionship requires individuals to sacrifice often. Okay, that's fine. The word individuals, nice and universal, it reaches to everybody. So for me, I make my kids put that in their thesis, and all of my students' conclusions paragraphs are completely universal in nature.
Mm.
They will almost never talk about a character, and they might only name the author once in the first sentence. And that's how I make sure that we get that last universal kick in there, because truthfully, the prompt itself isn't always universal. It'll say something like, how does the setting influence elements in the story? But we want to get the kids to, how does it influence the work as a whole? What's it like in the story? And then what does that setting do outside of the story? And so, because of that, that's how I kind of deal with that with my kids. I give them a certain spot where they are forced to actually pinpoint the universality of the story itself, and they know that they have to do it at the end of the thesis and in their conclusion.
I like that. I like the way you approach that. It's a little more structured than the way that I've done it. I tend to talk about like the overall message. What is the
Right,
audience supposed to take away from this that pertains to themselves? It's not just going to be, like you said, George and Lenny and something particular with them. They illustrate something that's
right,
that's larger. The way that I tend to describe it is, yes, overall message, and then for the conclusion there ought to be some sort of mic drop significance.
right.
That's
It's funny that you say mic drop, because I call mine the glass slipper.
oh
I'm like,
yeah.
you need to leave something that gets that reader to want to chase you down throughout the country and be like, I just need to talk to that person more. Like, no doubt about it.
Yeah, mine when I first heard that, the idea of the mic drop, it really helped me with my own conclusions because
Yeah,
it clicked, something clicked where I'm like, oh, okay, so you're supposed to say something that has that kind of significance, and so since it helped me so much, I figured um, I would pass it along.
and one thing, right? One thing too, that's also with the idea of conclusions for just a minute, is that if you're doing a poetry analysis or a prose analysis, one of the things that I make sure my kids do, their conclusions are going to be fully universal in nature. So there's not going to be a discussion of characters and whatnot in the story or the text or the poem. But I will ask them to try to include a 3 to 5 sentence section of text that relates universally in the very last sentence. So try to really synthesize the universality with the text itself, and it looks really, really spicy. So I do require that of them as well. And when they nail it, you're just like, oh man! And it is a mic drop. You're just like, boom! All right, you win. I'm good. It's awesome.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I'm getting ideas for my AP class now.
Well, part of my little pitch here, right? But I have gone through on the Garden of English channel questions 1, 2, and 3, and I have my thesis templates that go through this mold with the universality, and I've got my conclusion videos as well that show how it works with steps. Like, here's the step to create the conclusion that gets that quote in there to make it like extra spicy. So you could check those out too.
Yeah, definitely. I would recommend that you do. Kind of a last just question since I have you here. You mentioned conclusions, introductions. Normally, when I'm teaching sophomores, for instance, we'll do a lot of 5-paragraph essays. Very very structured introduction, 3-body paragraph, conclusion, and then I talk about some of these things, that topic sentences and mic drop conclusions and things like that. With an AP exam essay, I know that there's not that same kind of stringent organization, but are there elements, just broadly speaking, that you do look for in organizing those essays?
So what I look for in particular is the consistent connection between the concrete and the abstract, right? And that's why I go back to the topic sentence, right? Where it's nice to have here's the device, technique, or whatnot, and the why, because I'm always looking for, do I see the concrete and the abstract consistently being combined? And then when it comes to commentary, I'm looking for the same thing. And I don't care how many paragraphs it is, but I am looking for the correlation coming throughout. I see what's happening in the story, but I also see it connecting to the abstract character of so and so, or I see it influencing the plot in this way, or I see it connecting to this theme, and that's what I'm looking for. How kids do that can totally change from one teacher to another as long as they convey it. But the real key point of the pattern that we're looking for as readers is the concrete connecting to the abstract throughout, and not having it be clunky, kind of like concrete, concrete, concrete. I'm going to say something abstract, but not connect the two. And one of the best ways to actually do that is to just use the word because. For most kids that struggle with their commentary, if they consistently get scores back as like a 1, 2, 0, and it's like you need more commentary or better commentary, if they go to their sentences where they think they're providing commentary, typically they just have to put the word because at the end of the sentence, and that will force them to provide the commentary that they're actually missing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me and having this conversation. I think it's going to be really helpful for my AP students and the other people who watch this channel. So make sure that you check out Garden of English. There are resources there that are really helpful. So that's pretty much it. If
Can
you
I
have
interject one more common problem that I have with my kids?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. One common problem that I have with my kids that I just want to, which I hope is more universal than just to me, is when it comes to the prompt, especially a question 3, right? My kids often think that they're answering the prompt, but they don't. My example would be if I have a prompt about betrayal, they write their whole paper and they don't say the word betrayal at all. And I'm like, the prompt has the word betrayal in it. I'm pretty sure that that needs to be the word that I see the most throughout your paper. So I don't know if you've ever seen that in your classroom, but it shows up in mine all the time. The kids think they're writing about the prompt and they're not, just because they don't talk about the betrayal, or they don't talk about, I'm trying to think of another one. Maturity, right? When a prompt about maturity, it's like, well, then if it's about maturity, you need to have language that relates to maturing all the way throughout. And sometimes they seem to forget. And if AP doesn't stand for agony and pain or anxiety and pressure, but rather answer the prompt. Like, in order to know if you're doing that, you'll actually use the word that shows up in the question 3 more than anything else. So pardon me for interrupting, but I was like, oh, that's an important one I totally forgot about until that moment.
No,
So
no, I'm glad that you threw that in. Yeah, sometimes I'll see students start out, betrayal, betrayal, maturity, maturity, and then they'll start chasing something really shiny and cool that they found, and it's interesting, but it's not as relevant as it could be. So yeah, that's a great reminder.
all right.
All
Yeah,
right,
thank you so much for having me on.
you are very welcome. Yeah, that is it for today. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye.